Well, good morning, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And this morning, we're delighted to have another interview with Harley Schlanger of LaRouchePack.com. And Harley Schlanger is going to discuss with me the status of our election fraud, and the broader historical context that we can learn from Shakespeare. So, let's bring Harley onto the screen here, and we will get ourselves started. Just a second here. Not sure why. Hold on, we're going to have a little technical delay. Hope I haven't lost Harley.
I'm still here.
Huh. Sorry, guys, we're waiting for the delay of YouTube to bring Harley over to the screen. There's some technical problem going on here, Harley. I apologize to you. I can hear you, but for some reason,
Well, maybe we should just proceed with audio and see what happens.
Yeah, I don't know if we have a choice right now. For some reason, this screen is frozen, and I'd love to have you with the video, but for some reason, it's not showing up. So, okay, I think everybody can hear you, and so let's go ahead and have a chat without the audio. It's been over a month since or been about a month since we talked, Harley, and of course we've had an election since then, and you've been very busy with your daily blog report that comes out every morning on LaRouche Pack. Well, you've been very, very vocal about criticizing the election, and pointed out a number of reasons why Trump won, and this is a big case of fraud. But I'm going to let you tell us a little bit more about your perspective as as we encounter what appears to me to be a very fraudulent result that needs to be overturned. So, Harley Schlanger, it's all yours.
Well, let me start with an interesting comment from Nancy Pelosi, who can usually be counted on saying something that is both idiotic but also covers or includes a kernel of truth. She was asked why the Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives. And she said, well, to his credit, Donald Trump really brought out a big vote. Now, isn't that interesting that she would admit that Trump brought out a big vote, but somehow those votes didn't go to Trump? I mean, there's an incongruity there. And I think that's the incongruity which has to be investigated. Now, there are so many ironies in the charge that it's baseless to say that there was fraud and that we have to get on with it, certify Biden, and move ahead. You know, the first of those ironies is the idea that Trump should concede and get it over with. In my view, we've had 4 years of the Democrats not accepting the results of 2016. So, you know, what's the rush? There are so many irregularities. Now, the problem is that I'm not sure Rudy Giuliani is the best person for the investigation. I would put it entirely in Sidney Powell's hands because she's looking at something very different. What Sidney's investigating is this question of the intelligence services capabilities to manipulate votes. And she's identified several examples of that. One is the Dominion voting systems. The other is something called Smartmatic. And then there's something called a computer program called Hammer with a specific application called Scorecard, which was designed originally to use in other countries to change their votes. And people like Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, top technical experts and whistleblowers who left the NSA after 9/11 have been writing about it, talking about it. General McInerney, there are a whole number of people who have been discussing it. And what they're saying is that the irregularities that you have to look at go beyond the normal things that people associate with vote fraud. That is, urban machines that can vote people who are registered living in vacant lots, or such things as people who moved out of the state, or people who are dead voters, or his best demographic. But beyond that, that's not going to add up to the numbers needed to overturn the election. Things to look at are things like this Michigan situation, where the vote counting stopped for a couple of hours, and then all of a sudden 130,000 votes showed up, every single one for Biden, not a single one for Trump. Wisconsin, something similar. Georgia, now they're finding whole areas of counties that were not counted. In Michigan, the Wayne County Election Board initially was not going to certify the results, and then when one of the Democratic board members said, if you don't certify the results, you're a racist, the Republicans gave in. But that would have been an important potential victory for the Trump campaign. So where we stand now is that until December 14th, when the electors cast their vote, or actually I think December 8th is when the electors are certified, and then on the 14th they cast their votes, there's still an investigation. And instead of rushing and saying it's baseless, there's no evidence, if that's true, then why not wait till December 14th? Now, I think probably there should be some concession made to Biden that he gets a certain amount of national security briefings. He probably won't remember them anyway. But the idea that there's no reason to have this investigation to make sure the vote was accurate and clear and unequivocal, don't you want that? Why not let it play out? And I find it hypocritical that people who say that there's no evidence of vote fraud for 4 years ran stories about Russia collusion when there was never any evidence of Russia collusion. So I blame the media, I blame the anti-Trump crowd, and I think people should just take a couple moments to reflect on what's important, why the sanctity of our vote is so important. And if you're so sure there's no fraud, then let the Trump team try and show it. But I think that there probably will be discovered a preponderance of fraud, probably operated through these same intelligence networks that were running the Russiagate scandal as a regime change coup against Donald Trump.
How much confidence do you have in Sidney Powell and the fact that she's been Mike Flynn's attorney for very visibly for quite some time now, over a year? George Webb and I went to the trials and saw her in action and saw Mr. General Flynn there contending with some very difficult judges. So are we going to end up in court with this? And is she the right person to do it?
Well, I think she is. I'm not sure Rudy Giuliani is. I think what Sidney Powell showed in the Flynn case is that it's not so much what you do in the court, it's the preparation, it's the investigation. And she smoked out the documents that had been hidden by the FBI. She had a series of motions and investigations that enabled her to prove conclusively that people like Peter Strzok and Andrew McCabe carried out fraud in the investigation of Michael Flynn, including in the courtroom. And that they would tell exculpatory evidence, wrongdoings for which they should be in jail, including Comey, who oversaw the whole process. Now, the fact that she's working with Flynn is something else to think about. That means, since we know Flynn has an intelligence background, is it possible that Flynn knows something about how these operations were run in other countries with regime change, color revolutions, using vote fraud techniques? And that's what Kirk Wiebe and Bill Binney are asserting, that this program Scorecard if you have a vote that's within 3% or so between the two candidates, you can very quickly and systematically, without notice, change the votes around. And so that's what she's been looking into. I think she'll do the job of the investigation if necessary. And then the only question is, will you find a court where they'll listen to it? Because, she proved that Flynn was set up by the FBI in a perjury trap, and yet the judge in the case is still refusing to dismiss it, even though the Justice Department said they want to drop the case. But I think she's the right person, and I think what she's saying is quite to the point.
Well, that gets me to the bigger question, I guess. Why hasn't Flynn been exonerated by Judge Sullivan? What does this tell us about the people that appointed Judge Sullivan? And I guess my general idea is that this really is about the explosion of our economy, the economy of the entire world, that is, being tied into these massive banks. And as you've described it very well, the Davos billionaires are all looking for a place to finance the next tranche of money that they need to pay off the interest on their own debts. These huge billionaires that are also great debtors that don't want to talk about the fact that they owe people money, maybe they owe each other money, but with the existence of interest payments, always as I think Einstein said, the compound interest being the most powerful force in the universe, is that powerful force strong enough to defeat the American Republic? That's what's at stake right now. Are we going to continue with a republic, or are we going to turn ourselves over to the bankers?
Well, John, this is one of the reasons I like talking to you, because what you just presented was a question which incorporates a number of complex issues, but all of which are right to the point of our present circumstance. Let me start from the small, just to give a sense of something that's important. This company, Smartmatic, which is one of the companies involved in the alleged fraud. Smartmatic has as its president an admiral, I think it's Neffinger is his name, who is on the Atlantic Council. He's also been appointed to the Biden transition team. So isn't it a little unseemly that the head of the voting company, the company that does a lot of the voting software, is on Biden's transition team? The chairman of the company is even more interesting. Lord Mark Brown, a British nobleman who sits on a number of boards of the City of London, but interestingly was the City of London, the United Kingdom's conduit for communication with Barack Obama when Obama was the candidate, according to Samantha Power, who knows this. So here you have a high-level insider from the City of London with the Open Society Fund, Lord Malik Brown, who's the chairman of the company that's counting the vote. So that's an interesting thing to look at, isn't it? Now, this brings us to the question of why would they take such a risk? If in fact this is true, there was vote fraud committed on a massive scale, why would they take such a risk? Well, they took a big risk in concocting the whole Russiagate story. They assumed it wasn't going to be a big risk because they thought Hillary Clinton would win and it could get swept aside. But after Hillary lost and they couldn't sweep it aside, they kept lying to the present day about Russian collusion and about Trump cooperation with them. So why would it be any different with the vote? They assumed they could pull off the fraud, Biden would get in, and it would all be swept under the rug. Now, what does this have to do with finance? And that's why I appreciate the question so much. There's a process underway right now which is modeled on doing on a much bigger scale what was done with the Bank for International Settlements when it was founded in the early 30s. That is to set up a global institution that's a central bank of the banks that would initiate the process of moving to a globalized digital currency. Now, why do they want something like this? Well, the proposal is that the central banks issue the digital currency in coordination. The central banks are not national institutions. They're institutions that represent the interests of the largest private banks and financial institutions in the world, including the shadow banking system. This has two aspects to it, this globalized, digitalized currency. The first is that it would continue the process of extending massive amounts of credit to these institutions which are technically bankrupt. And this occurred, we saw the bankruptcy in 2008 with the crash then. They got bailed out then. There's more debt today, more worthless debt today, and they need to be bailed out again. And they're talking about having central banks continue to issue currency, whether it's in the form of quantitative easing, in the form of overnight loans, green bonds, new kinds of fraudulent speculative instruments that will keep the liquidity going to the banks. But the other side of it is that what they're calling for, and when I say they, let me be specific. Last week there was a conference in the city of London presided over by none other than Prince Charles. His co-presenters were Michael Bloomberg, the former Green Czar of the United Nations, former mayor of New York City, Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, Christine Lagarde, the former head of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, who's now the head of the European Central Bank, and Georgieva, who's the current head of the International Monetary Fund. They laid out this strategy, and they said they went beyond this idea of just opening the floodgates of liquidity for the banks through the central banking system. They said the central banks should take over fiscal policy as well. In other words, spending policy. Now, why is this important? Well, what is a republic? A republic is where you have institutions of self-government, where the people elect representatives who are the ones responsible for determining how a government spends the money. What happens if you take that away from elected governments and give it to councils of technocrats, which is what this proposal says? This proposal was identified a year ago at the Jackson Hole, Wyoming conference by Carney and by Fink of BlackRock. And they called it a regime change in financial policy. So in other words, you don't just have the central banks controlling the amount of liquidity in the system, but where it goes. Now, then why elect a legislature? Why elect a Congress, a parliament, if they have no say over the money? Well, that's the question. That's what, to answer your question, do we save the republic? That's what we have to do to save the republic, is keep financial and economic, we have to take financial policy back from the central banks and the private bankers into a national bank that's there for the interests of the people. But secondly, make sure that the spending is determined by the representatives of the people, not technocrats chosen to bail out bankrupt banks. So that's why Biden had to be brought in as president. Donald Trump would not go along with this. Now, he may not have a fully thought out scheme, plan to counter it, but he would not tolerate this. And no one should tolerate it. No one who is a citizen of a republic should tolerate such a scheme. But that's what a major part of the issue is. And the people they're talking about as Biden's likely choices for his economic counsel, for Treasury Secretary, I saw the name Janet Yellen come up. Lael Brainerd of the Federal Reserve Board is another choice. They're talking about people who are committed to this monetarist policy of determining the future by technocrats acting on behalf of the biggest banks in the world. One other aspect of this is they're talking about downgrading and eventually eliminating commercial banks, which means your checking account, your deposits, your business account, and replacing it with some form of banking that's controlled completely by the central banks. And with this global digitalized currency, they're going to know exactly how much money you have and where that money goes. So it's a merger of the surveillance state with a banker's dictatorship, and add the final piece, a war machine. That's why they wanted to get Biden in, because they cannot keep this system together unless they have top-down control over finance, the political system, the investment policy, and the war machine. And this, of course, is what we've been fighting since Franklin Roosevelt's death, to take away from the bankers. At that time, it was the Dulles brothers and people of that sort, the Harrimans, the Arm and Hammers, take the power away from them, as Kennedy tried, to put it in the hands of a national bank or a treasury, as opposed to the private Federal Reserve System.
Well, there's a lot there to talk about. I start first from the Constitution, which says that the Congress shall have the power to coin money. It doesn't say Congress has to coin money. Unfortunately, I think it should, because it's only Congress that can keep this whole system honest. So it says the Congress has the power to coin money, and the idea would be nobody else does. But they got around that, as you know, by creating these paper notes, these Federal Reserve notes that are used in lieu of money, but they're not coins. So since they're not coins, technically, they got some judges to agree with them that, oh, well, you can print money, you just can't coin it. Well, that's a technical distinction that I don't think the founding fathers would approve of in one iota, because what they've done is allowed us to create wealth out of wealth. Instead of creating wealth out of industry and labor and technological advancements, they're creating wealth by simply trading these pieces of paper back and forth, which have now created an incredible debt bubble. My immediate response to what you just said is, this is why they have to pull out all the stops. This is why they have to have a Biden who is really just a zombie, for goodness sakes. The guy hasn't got the mental capacity to understand the issues anymore, and I am sorry to say I doubt that Kamala Harris has it either. But what we do have is a population that is starting to realize that we're getting ripped off really bad. And what we could do if President Trump was reelected would be to push President Trump into doing a national monetary policy, to push the president into saying, hey, you know what? This whole Federal Reserve System is a big farce, and it's not federal. They don't reserve any money, and it has nothing to do with the good interests of the population of the United States. So let's just cut them loose. You know?
Well, John, let me go back to what you were saying about the founding fathers, because if people read some of the debates that were going on at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, and then look at some of the letters written by Hamilton and some of his four reports to the Congress, what's clear is that they were saying that the reason they had to go to war with England, they had to have a revolutionary break with England, was over policy, financial policy. That the British would not allow the colony to determine, or the colonies to determine what to do with whatever money they had. It had to be determined overseas in England. And the question of who controls credit, currency, and debt was a living matter of great urgency to the people who made the revolution. And it's connected directly to the what's in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, that we're establishing a government, and it's in the preamble to the Constitution, which concerns itself with the general welfare of the population, not the private interests of an oligarchy. We made a revolution against the British monarchy and against the British East India Company system, which basically, as you said, concentrated the wealth in the hands of a very small number of people and let them determine what to do with it. And under the British system, which is pretty much what we have right now, the private interests are determining public policy. And by that I mean the Federal Reserve is controlled by private bankers. The policies that are made, as we saw after the 2008 crash, what did Obama do? Obama doubled down the speculative economy. He basically said, we've got to bail out the speculators. What about the people who lost their homes? What about the people who lost their jobs, saw their factories and their industries and their small businesses shut down, and the manufacturers leave the country? Is that not in the interest of the American people to be involved in discussing that? The Dodd-Frank bill was written to protect the private banking system. Now, I'm not against private bankers. I'm for regulating them to make sure that there's a public trust there, that if you give your money over to them, you can be sure they're not putting it into speculative scams and Ponzi schemes for which they'll get bailed out by the government, but you won't. You'll lose it. That's what the founding fathers had in mind when they talked about establishing a national bank. That monetary policy should be to protect the interests of the whole population. This is what John Kennedy meant when he said we need policies that will cause a rising tide to lift all boats, not to build bigger boats for the handful of billionaires tied to Davos, the Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Wall Street ruling class we have. They're incompetent. They're a bunch of thieves. And they're the ones who funded this whole vote fraud operation. It's interesting. There's an article in Bloomberg News, November 3rd, 2018. I don't have the article in front of me, but it's something like private equity firms fund voter security system. And it's about this guy, Krebs, who just got fired by Trump yesterday. Krebs was brought in. He had been the cybersecurity chief of Microsoft. He was brought in supposedly to protect the voting system from foreign interference. Apparently, he forgot that London is a foreign place because his operation was funded by the largest banks, including British banks and financial firms. And what they did is they set up a system that would protect whatever they wanted to protect in the vote, not to assure a fair vote. And then Krebs' agency under Homeland Security put out a statement the other day saying this was the most secure election you've ever had. There was no sign of fraud or anything of the sort. And that's, I think, part of the reason he was fired. But the system that they brought in was developed to protect the banks. That's what the Bloomberg article said on November 3rd, 2018. So, this is something that, when Krebs was fired, they brought out 3 or 4 people who said, oh, this is Trump being an authoritarian lunatic. This was a great guy. He did all the right things. No one talks about what he actually did, who he brought in to fund his operation, who benefited from this operation. And that's the problem with the media. So, if you want to have a common good or a general welfare, you need to have a Congress which represents the people. Now, I think it's fascinating that in this election, where all the media was attacking the Republicans in the House and the Senate, many of whom I don't like. I think a lot of the Republicans in Congress are neoconservatives and warmongers and also neoliberal swindlers. But they were under attack because they were defending President Trump. Now, they were supposedly going to go down to a big defeat, lose more seats in the House, and probably lose the Senate. It didn't happen. So are you telling me that people went out in large numbers to vote for Susan Collins and the Danes up in Montana and these other Republicans, and the North Carolina senator who were supposedly threatened with losing? Do you tell me that people would vote for the Republicans there and then go and vote for Joe Biden? I don't buy it. It's an illogical point. And illogic doesn't win in court, but it certainly gives you a direction for investigating how this happened.
I think you put an awful lot in a nutshell when you said that whoever it was forgot that London is not part of our country. That
Right.
that Great Britain is not us. That's them. They're the ones we fought against. They're the ones that we had to fight a war to get free of. I'd say at least 2, if not 3, big wars to get free of them, and then they keep coming back. Well, I want to go back to my one point about the money system, which is, remember from history, the Greenback Dollar. And the Greenback Dollar was created under the Abraham Lincoln administration in the 1860s in order to do something that couldn't be done otherwise. And the situation was that with the South seceding and the North getting ready for war, everybody that had gold was hoarding the gold. They were not going to let the gold leave their hands until the situation calmed down, because gold was wealth. Gold was physical wealth back then, and it still is. But back then, that was backing the currency or the whatever they had. They had banknotes, but everything was backed by gold. So everybody hung on to their gold. So when it came time to buy uniforms and buy bullets and buy ships and buy all of the stuff that you need to wage a war, the U.S. government didn't have any money. There wasn't any gold to pay to the providers of services and products for war. So one congressman came up with the idea of just floating the currency based on the full faith and credit of the United States generally, and not backed by gold. And unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with right now, is what a lot of people are calling fiat currency. Currency that's currency because the government says it's currency and for no other reason. Well, here's my proposed solution, is that we create a currency system that is constitutionally based upon the Congress's exclusive right to coin money, and that our money be the full faith and credit money, that our money is backed by the goodwill of the population of this country, and that these Federal Reserve notes that we've been saddled with should be dissociated from the full faith and credit of the population of this country. Let them go out there and fix it on their own. Move the whole problem away from the United States government and let the banks figure it out among themselves, who owes who what, and how many of these fiat currency money that they want to trade back and forth until they decide, well, they finally got their bit. The danger is, if you let Biden come in, then that can't happen. It's just impossible to happen. But with Trump, we could get Trump to say, "Look, there's no way that the American people are ever going to pay off $20 trillion of debt. It's just impossible." And in moral sense, in moral terms, we didn't borrow that money. We didn't spend that money. We didn't get that money. This is the product of us being ripped off after every war, especially World War II, when we were told we were going to get a great peace dividend. Harry Truman was going to give us a peace dividend, and then this committee of 12 or whatever it was that decided, well, you know what, we can't really share the results of the war with the American people, so we're going to tell them that actually we didn't win any money. The money is all gone, and Europe is bankrupt, and there's no money there. BS, man. They weren't stupid enough to spend all their money during the war. They squirreled it away just like people squirreled away the gold in the American Civil War. So the money is there for them to sort their own problems out, is what I'm saying. But the American people got ripped off when they created the Federal Reserve, and they've been getting ripped off ever since by these speculative bankers that make money not by doing anything, but by simply choosing their investments wisely and then running the competition out of business, or even worse. So it's the system that we have now is unsustainable. We could never pay that debt, but if we let Biden have the presidency, then the bankers are going to force us. They're going to force the American people to pay off that $20 trillion, and that's going to impoverish every single citizen of this country that's not already part of the rich people cabal that's running this thing.
Well, John, the way they do that is if you have the shift to a digitalized currency where they're constantly providing fresh liquidity to the speculators, you're going to have a hyperinflation because we're not producing anything. And I'll go back in a moment to how you avoid an inflation. But what they're going to do is allow, by the hyperinflation, the banks and corporations to write down their debts without losing anything. And at the same time, sucking the money out of the checking accounts, savings accounts, pension funds, retirement accounts, and so on, so that we will be left impoverished. They'll be in business. And this is, in a sense, how the British stayed on top through the last 2 centuries. Now, just to go back to this question you were posing about the Greenback policy, the original idea from that was Hamilton's policy. And Hamilton's policy was passed on through a series of economists, one of whom is Henry Carey, who's not very well known now because he's been under attack for the last 2 centuries. Carey's father, Matthew Carey, was a close ally of Benjamin Franklin, the publisher of Franklin's works, and passed on to his son this opposition to the British East India Company and its method of exploiting the colonies for cheap raw materials and cheap labor. Not quite a slave labor system, because the British cleverly did away with slavery, but they enslaved, in a certain sense, all the colonies that they had, and they welcomed the other Europeans to do the same. Now, our country, people didn't want that. They were fighting against an oligarchy. Many came to the United States to escape the battles in Europe between competing oligarchs. And the question then is, how do you create a money supply that's not controlled by a small number of people? That's what Hamilton was trying to do. He's slandered by people who say he established a Bank of England type national bank. No, it wasn't a Bank of England type national bank because the Congress determined what the credit should be. Now, Hamilton's ideas went through Henry Carey, Erasmus Peshine Smith, Friedrich List, who was the one who came over to Germany and brought this system to Bismarck. The idea of the American system is what you were just saying. You back your currency. Ultimately, you have a gold reserve. But the currency is backed by the productive capability of the whole economy. That is, if you extend credit that goes to areas where you're producing goods that are adding to the total wealth, real wealth, not paper wealth. Whether it's developing a railroad, which requires steel, steam engine development, all kinds of equipment that's related to that, that uplifts the productivity of every person employed in that system. You increase the ability to have currency that can be backed by something tangible. Now, the people who are running things today don't want goods production. They say goods production is using up the scarce resources. We have too many people. We need to conserve. We need to cut back. We need to eat less. We don't need air conditioning. We don't need heating. We don't need carbon. The idea that carbon dioxide is a poison is a scientific fraud. And yet how many young people are being taught that every single day in the schools? And if you have a carbon-free economy, it means you don't have the quality and density of energy production that's needed to produce, to sustain 350 million people in the United States and 7 billion plus people worldwide. People are going to die. Well, the people who drafted the policies of the Green New Deal, and that includes people like Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, and now the European Union has adopted a completely insane green policy. What they're basically saying is, we're not going to produce. People have to have simpler lives. It's our consumption that's causing global warming. And this is why I think what you were saying about Biden and even Harris, they're not going to be running anything. The people who ran the Obama administration are going to be running things. Now, I just wanted to get one other example of what to look forward to if Biden ends up being inaugurated as president. One of the key people on his transition team in charge of the COVID situation is a man named Ezekiel Emanuel, the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who was the author of what people called the death panel policy of Obamacare. Emanuel believes that once you turn 70, and definitely when you turn 75, you're now a useless eater. You're no good to yourself or anybody else. He wrote an article in Atlantic Monthly during the period of the Obamacare discussion, where he said, "Why I want to die before I'm 75." Now, is that the kind of person we want to have allocating so-called scarce healthcare resources at a time of a crisis? Well, this is what you have with the Biden administration. These are the people who are going to be making policy. Who does Emmanuel work for? Insurance companies. Who wrote Obamacare? The insurance companies. They make money when people die because they don't have to pay out money for care. So we're seeing this. What happens when private interests are on steroids running the government? The cartels, big pharma, energy cartels, the defense sector, the banks and insurance companies, they make the policies, and they really don't care if you live or die, or if you have enough money to pay the rent. We saw that with the way they let people be thrown out of their homes in 2008 and afterwards. So this is the bigger picture that we face. Now, very quickly on monetary policy, this is one of the areas where Lyndon LaRouche had his greatest influence, because he proposed that we set up a new financial system based on going back to fixed exchange rates, which we had during the period from 1944 to 1971, which simply meant that nations would carry out their policy with the intent to have enough production to back up their currency. And that you couldn't speculate. You couldn't make money speculating on currencies. Once Nixon ended the fixed exchange rate system, it opened the door for wholesale speculation, a casino economy, including in such things as currencies, which means George Soros could go in and bankrupt a country by speculating against its currency. That's how I made a fortune on the pound, and that's how I made a fortune against the people of Malaysia, Thailand, and elsewhere in 1997-98. So you go to a fixed exchange rate system, possibly a basket of currencies, and you make bilateral and multilateral agreements, not free trade agreements, but fair trade agreements, where nations work together for each other's benefit. And that's what LaRouche proposed, and he said the United States, Russia, and China are the three countries that have enough military power and economic productive power to dictate the policies to the global bankers. Instead, we're seeing regime change against Trump, against Putin, and against Xi Jinping, funded by the same people who don't want to have sovereign nations work together for a sound monetary system. So I think in a nutshell, that's what we're dealing with. And when you mentioned the question of the British before, the British have always opposed the American system because their idea of an economic system is the shadow banking system of the City of London. And that's what we're fighting. That's what the fight ultimately boils down to. A sovereign American republic versus a British financial swindle.
The word republic, of course, as you know, and most people do know, comes from Latin res publica, which literally translated means public thing. And public things are transparent. You cannot have a republic with a shadow banking system, because then it's no longer a public banking system. You can't have a republic when the CIA is running things behind the scenes. That's not a republic. That's something else. So, have we ever really achieved the ideal republic? I don't know if the United States ever has gotten there yet, but that has got to be our star. That's got to be our lodestar. That's where we're headed, to a transparent system where all citizens are able to get the knowledge they need to make a sensible choice in an election. And this past election has been an example of complete obfuscation of all knowledge that's important to choosing your vote. A complete obfuscation, and they're so good at it now. You know, they throw the sex things at you, and the horrible ideas of, what did Hunter Biden do in Ukraine, and we can get all excited about, and people do, unfortunately, they latch on to the hot topic discussion and let the really important stuff go, because they get just sidetracked, and then they have to go to work, and then you got to take the kids up from school, and then you got to go to soccer practice. So who has time to wade through all this crap? Well, that's all been calculated, hasn't it? So that they know that if they lay just enough crap upon everybody, that nobody's going to have an ability to be a good citizen. You're not going to have the time or the resources to hunt for the truth. That's why a place like LaRouche Pack and the Schiller Institute are so important to preserving what we have and enhancing our republic and our open system that should be the system we're supposed to have, instead of this horrible system that we've been dragged down into since World War II by people, as you say, just like the Dulles brothers, the Harrimans, the Rockefellers, and the entire list of usual suspects. So these elites have somehow got to be taken out of our equation, and let them go and trade their Federal Reserve notes among themselves, but let's have our own currency. That's my hope, is that if we can get President Trump reelected, then we're going to have to do a whole lot of work to clean up the Congress either way. But let me change the subject now, because I promised everybody
John,
we.
can I just say
Oh
one
yeah,
thing on that?
yeah, sure. Sorry.
I think the important thing there is that the corruption that's involved in this present system hasn't fully been exposed yet. We've seen bits and pieces of it in terms of the FBI corruption with the FISA court, people like John Brennan, Gina Haspel, the CIA director, who's still sitting on declassified documents. There's all sorts of things that have come out in public, and yet the diversion is still there. You mentioned Ukraine. I included this extensive discussion of this in my presentation last Saturday, where I pointed out that they turned the real scandal of Ukraine, which is Biden working with remnants of the Clinton State Department, with people like Jonathan Weiner, who was Kerry's former top guy, Victoria Nuland, very well-known neoconservative, George Soros, supposedly a liberal. And who were they allied with in overthrowing the Yanukovych government? A Nazi movement in Ukraine, the Azov battalions, the Banderistas, who proudly traced their nationalist roots to the Ukrainians who joined the Nazi SS after Germany conquered Ukraine in the early 1940s. That's who Biden was allied with. Now that's a real scandal. And instead, what did they get people focused on? A few $1 million that were paid to Hunter Biden, and maybe some of it was skimmed off to Joe Biden. And Hunter Biden has sex and drug problems. So that's what people bought into as the Ukraine scandal. And that's unfortunately what Rudy Giuliani got them focused on. When the bigger scandal is, why was Biden involved in this coup where he allied himself with Soros and Nazis? Because they intended to use Ukraine as a new staging point of eastward motion for NATO troops. At the same time, they're trying to overthrow the Belarus government with a color revolution, put troops in the Baltic states, in the Black Sea, and then move NATO into the South China Sea as part of a new Indo-Pacific containment policy against China and Russia. That's the real scandal. And President Trump was poorly served by advisors who told him, look, people won't get that. You have to give them the dirty story of Hunter Biden pocketing some money and using his papa's influence. So that's why I went to Shakespeare, because so often in Shakespeare you have plays which show how people fall for the diversion when the real corruption is going on right under their nose. And I think that's the lesson we have to learn from this. Is there anyone in this country who believes the CIA is really out to protect your interests against terrorists and international criminal gangs? No, the CIA is part of the terrorists and international criminal gangs. So I made a proposal, and I think we're going to be producing something on this, that if President Trump wants to come up with an effective flank for fighting to put Russiagate to rest, and at the same time undermine the people who used NSA cyber capabilities to fix the election, Why not pardon Edward Snowden and Julian Assange? Bring them back to the country immediately, safe passage, and let them tell the story that they know. Assange about where the Russiagate material really came from, and it wasn't Russia. And Snowden, who knows very well how 9/11 was used to establish a security surveillance state where metadata is not only collected on everyone, but used to profile and control you. That, I think, would be the best way in the short time remaining till the new inauguration to address this whole question of how to overturn it. Show the full corruption going back to 9/11. And obviously, John, as you know, we can go back longer than that, much further than that. But let's start with the post 9/11 period, the corruption of the security state, the permanent warfare. You know, when Trump says we're going to finally get out of Afghanistan, he's accused of premature evacuation. Premature, it's 20 years we've been in there.
That's a funny little phrase you just said, premature evacuation.
That's a good one.
Well, that's of course that was JFK's problem too. Is he wanted to prematurely evacuate Vietnam, and they didn't like.
That's the only time he prematurely evacuated.
They didn't like that either. But your metaphor with Macduff and I'm sorry, with Macbeth, I think is a beautiful one, and you've just mentioned Snowden and all as the people that could come back as the ghost of Banquo at the end of the play and say, "Hey, guess what? You know, there's a future here, and it does not involve the corrupt regime that this play's been about so far." That we're going to uncover the facts. We're going to have a real republic where people can see with transparency, you know, just exactly how this Macbeth usurped the office of presidency of the United States through fraud and other means that we'll be exploring, you know, here on my channel, and I know you guys are all over this. I have to mention. Yeah, go ahead, Harley. Yeah.
Can you imagine John Brennan's face if Edward Snowden is brought to stand at a Rose Garden press conference with Donald Trump to talk about what he knows about these cyber capabilities? Or if Julian Assange is brought in to talk about it? That's the Banquo's ghost. And the point that I made in this discussion is that Shakespeare had a superior method of intelligence to lay out what it is that's the problem. It's the axiomatics of the court, the patterns of behavior in the court, whether it's Hamlet or Macbeth. You know, the Banquo's ghost is an apt example because Banquo figured out, he was there when Macbeth was told by the witches that he's going to be king. And then Banquo warned him at that point that he fears that you're interested in this idea. And of course, then Macbeth murders the existing king, the current king, and blames it on two guards of the king's room. And then Banquo says to Macbeth, I fear that you did this. He let Macbeth know that he knew that Macbeth committed the murder. And then what does he do? He goes to the banquet that Macbeth had set up in order to keep up appearances. And he was murdered by murderers hired by Macbeth on the way to the banquet. And then he shows up at the banquet. So I titled my presentation, Banquo's Ghost at McBiden's Banquet. And if people want to see that, it's available on the schillerinstitute.com website. Just look for Banquo's Ghost there. But the bigger point is that we need to reintroduce these brilliant works of classical culture to upgrade the thinking of the American people, to move people above their total fixation on Instagram and likes and dislikes, and actually engage once again in complex and profound thoughts, as Percy Shelley said, concerning man and nature. That in a moment like this, where so much is threatened, and yet so much is at stake, we need a higher quality of thinking. And that's what has to be introduced. And that was the goal of Lyndon LaRouche, beyond everything else. If you get people who can think better, they don't get suckered in to these kinds of scams that we've seen, whether it's the mortgage bubble, whether it's the overall debt bubble. Uh, and so that's how you avoid the corruption, is to give people these higher trips into their imagination of what could be, and then to give them the courage to fight for that.
Well, amen, Harley Schlanger. I think you've hit it exactly right. And how are you guys doing in terms of getting the word out? I ask that because there's so few places that are actually trying to do what you just did, and that is to to solve this puzzle, to say here's the way out, and that of course reminds me of the character Macduff in the play, where the popular interpretation of Macduff is tied with the phrase "lead on, Macduff," meaning at the end of this disaster, somebody has got to stand up and show the way and say, "Let's go this way," and that's why uh, George Webb chose the character Macduff to represent my father in the popular imagination, because I do believe that my father, a classmate at Loomis of George P. Schultz, was the anti-George P. Schultz, and if my father had lived, we would have had a completely different economic system as well as a much freer and fairer world. So but we have to rise up. We have to be Macduff. We have to be the Macduffs that are going to see that Banquo's ghost does play its role. That Banquo's ghost, in the form of a return of a Edward Snowden, of a Julian Assange, of others who have been quashed, that names that we don't even know yet, to shine a light on the true corruption, the incredible corruption that has put Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the position they sit in right now as putative uh, next president and vice president of the United States. That's what my channel is dedicated to, and I know that's what you guys are all about too. So I just wanted to ask you, how is it going? Do you feel like you're getting the word out over there?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think I told you before we came on that the numbers of views of my daily update, I do a daily update that is available on the YouTube site of LaRouche Pack Videos. At least it's still available as of this morning. What's interesting is on Facebook we have LaRouche Pack Videos, and the numbers since the election have gone from 2,000 or 3,000 views a day up to 60 or 70,000 views, because word is getting out that if you want to find out what's going on with the fraud, you want to find out about who's corrupt, where the real source of this is, go to LaRouche Pack on Facebook or YouTube. So what happened yesterday? We got a citation from Facebook threatening to cancel our platform there. Not surprising, you've been through that. So I think the fact that we went from 2,000 or 3,000 views to 70,000 views scared the hell out of them. And that's why we're now we're putting my daily updates on Parler as well as YouTube. We still have the LaRouche Pack website and the Schiller Institute website where you can see these. But this is a real war. And just to go back to Macduff for a moment, Macduff fled the country because he knew Macbeth was going to come out and try and kill him. And he did it knowing that he was leaving his family in danger. And Macbeth went and had his family killed. And so some people say, well, Macduff was acting out of revenge. No, he had a higher mission. What man leaves his family in danger like that, except one who has a sense that there's something more important than the security of his family, that the security of his family means nothing if you have a tyrant in charge of the country. And so those kinds of choices sometimes are made by people. Those are the heroes, people who are willing to put themselves at risk for the sake of the future. And, in Banquo's case, he was slain, but his son was able to flee, and his son became I don't know if his son became a king, but it was Banquo's line that eventually took over the monarchy there. So you look at classical culture and you realize we've been at war for centuries, for millennia, between the common people and a landed nobility, an oligarchy. Today, that oligarchy is an international financial class. And they're not going to give up power easily, as we saw when Trump got elected and they did everything they could to destroy him. It should be said that he did keep fighting, and that's to his credit. Now the question is, will the American people stand up for principle and defend our republic?
I want to give one more shout out before we wrap it up, and that is to a very fast growing new YouTube channel called Neighborhood News Studio. And Neighborhood News Studio has got some great reporters that are going around the country looking at local stories, looking at national stories, trying to spread the word just like you are. And they're now down in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where they're inviting people to come up, especially from Georgia, to discuss the corruption that's going on there in the Secretary of State's office, which is going to be a very hot issue coming up in the next few weeks. So I support them as well, and I think that's something that I would really like to see more people watching, the Neighborhood News Studio on YouTube. So let's give them a shout out as and to just remind everybody about McDuff's my mission, my dad's mission, is what you just said. It's drop everything and save the republic. We are McDuff. All of us are, and we have to rise to the occasion. This is the moment of our lives. This is the moment of history. History is calling on us to stand up for freedom, for justice, and for the Republic of the United States of America.
And John, history and the future. The future is calling on us also. And I'd like to ask your listeners if they want to be in touch with me, if they'd like to get more from what I'm doing, and in case we get booted off Facebook and YouTube where you can find me, you can still write to me at my email address. And I'm in touch with a number of your regular viewers. Write to me at harleysch@gmail.com. And I'll send you a link to my blog site for free so you can read my articles and get whatever other information we're putting out. So it's harleysch@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thanks a million again, Harley, and everybody out there at LaRouche Pack, LaRouche .pub, and also Schiller Institute for your great work, for your great archives of work from the past, and for your important thoughts as to what we need to do to preserve our future. It's been a great morning for me to have you with us here from Mystery Beach down here in North Carolina, where we're catching a little bit of vacation between shows. Thanks again, Harley, and best wishes to you.
Okay, see you soon, John.
Thanks. Bye. Bye bye now. Thanks everybody for being with us. Sorry I couldn't participate in the chat, and but I'll be checking in with you on the comments section.